All right, so we've already discussed what GDP is. So GDP is measuring production, but we also say that we use it to measure growth rates, and we also use it to measure quality of life, standards of living. So, and then we also use our circular flow to show how GDP is calculated. And today we want to discuss, well, if GDP measures production, we know how we measure it, and we know that it measures quality of life. We need to make sure that it doesn't fall short in a couple areas, which in fact it does. So here's some shortfalls of GDP as a measure of production and as a measure of standard of living. So we have our shortfalls of GDP. And the first way we use GDP is as a measure of production. So we want to understand ways that GDP doesn't fully measure production in a country. Okay, and there's two ways. The first way is that we constantly produce things that aren't sold on the market. So for example, I iron my own clothes. So I go home and I iron clothes, but that's not going to be included in GDP because there's no income exchange. There's no transaction involved there. However, if I would have taken those clothes and brought them to a launderer who ironed and pressed them for me, then it would be calculated in GDP because it would be in tax statements and income would have been transacted. Okay, so the first way is that it really doesn't measure what we call household production. So GDP doesn't include household production. And what we mean by that, let me zoom in. And what we mean by that is simply that we'll take it a simple case. So suppose I own a garden. So I go home and I till my garden and I buy resources for my garden and I plant the soil and I plant tomatoes and I spend a lot of time watering my tomatoes and growing the tomatoes, growing big, gorgeous tomatoes. Okay. Now I can do two things with those. I can pick them and take them inside and eat them myself, or I could pick those tomatoes and take them to the farmer's market. Okay, in one case, if I sell them at the farmer's market, they're the exact same tomatoes. If I sell them at the farmer's market, it's going to be included in GDP, so it's measuring that. However, if I take that same tomato and I just take it inside and eat it myself, so instead of selling it to somebody else to eat, I just eat that tomato myself, that's not going to be included in GDP. However, the exact same resources were being used to create that tomato. So I was producing tomatoes, but in one instance, when I take it to the farmer's market, GDP is going to capture that production. In the other instance, when I take it at home, when I take it inside and eat it myself on a sandwich, then it's not going to be included. So if we have household production, GDP doesn't capture that because there's no transaction taking place. There's no record of that transaction, and there's no cash exchange. Okay, so GDP doesn't include household production. And in this case, there's a lot of household production that we do. A lot of people do their own laundry, they cook their own meals, they sweep their own floors, they vacuum, they dust, they raise their own kids, right? They change their own diapers. You could hire out all of those services that would be included in GDP. But in a lot of instances, people decide to do that within the household. And so if we take total production of our country, it's going to be much higher than calculated GDP because there's a lot of time that you spent doing things yourself. The same could be said as taking your own notes. So you come to class, you take your own notes as compared to hiring somebody to come to class and take notes for you in economics. So in that case, right, it's the exact same thing. Somebody is putting in the exact same resources, the time and the materials to take notes in an econ classroom, but in one instance it's going to be included in GDP, in one instance it's not. However, we produce the exact same thing, so it should be included in production. So GDP doesn't include household production or things that were produced but not transacted. The second shortfall of GDP as a measure of production is when we produce something and it's transacted, but it's not recorded. Okay, and there's many instances where we have transactions that take place, but that aren't recorded. So probably the thing that comes to mind most is maybe illegal activities. So illegal drugs. So nobody's going to report to the government that I sold 10 kilos of cocaine or however you measure it, right? So we don't record illegal drugs, prostitution, mob activity, right? We don't include those, but there was production that took place. So again, resources were being used to make cocaine and to make, I don't know, mob hits, right? And so there was some sort of production there, but because it's not recorded, that transaction that takes place of cash for a good or service isn't recorded, GDP isn't going to measure it, okay? And we call that the underground economy. However, there's a lot of things in the underground economy that are perfectly legal. So for example, a lot of times people in middle school and high school might mow lawns or babysit, and they just take cash as a payment for that. So they're taking, like if I mowed somebody's lawn, I'm actually producing something and a transaction is taking place, cash for some mowing lawn, but I don't report that to the government. So GDP isn't going to pick up that transaction or that lawn mowing that happens by a lot of middle school and high school kids or babysitting. So in that case, there's a lot of perfectly legal activities that take place in the underground economy. It's just transactions that take place that aren't recorded. If I hire my friend to come paint my house, I'm probably not going to report that or file an income or tax return on that. So therefore, it's not going to be measured in GDP. So the second way that GDP falls short of measuring production is that GDP doesn't measure the underground economy. Okay, and we call the underground economy, so overall the underground economy includes legal and illegal activities. If we're looking at explicitly the illegal activities or the illicit activities in the underground economy, we tend to call that the shadow economy. So underground activities that are not legal. So we'd call that the shadow economy. But overall, there's production that takes place and a transaction that occurs. However, it isn't reported to the government and GDP doesn't pick it up. So overall, if we could account for household production in the underground economy in the US, GDP would be much higher, or production is much higher than GDP suggests in every country. And another interesting thing is that underground economy and household production tends to be much more favorable in poorer nations. So a lot of poorer nations would never hire a babysitter or a nanny to take care of the kids. They would do that themselves. So it's not going to be included in GDP. A lot of poorer nations also have a lot of transactions that just aren't reported to the government, so it's not included in GDP. So when we look at GDP data to measure rich and poor countries, we should be aware that richer countries are going to have a much smaller percentage of household production in underground economy as compared to poorer nations. So rich nations have a better job of their GDP measures capture total production much more than poorer nations. So if we look at GDP data, we're going to see big differences in nations. However, if we could include household production in the underground economy, those differences would shrink slightly. Okay, so GDP falls short in measuring production. The second way that it falls short is GDP is also used as a measure as a standard of living. So we're looking at societal well-being here. And GDP falls short in 4 areas in this instance. Number one is that there's a lot of countries where people work really long and tedious hours. However, their GDP tends to be very low. In the US, on average, people work about 36 hours per week. So, and our GDP tends to be very high. So in one instance, we have one nation that has very low GDP and a lot of long hours worked. And in the US, we have high GDP but very short hours worked as compared to other nations. So what we're not including in there is the value of leisure time. So if you could take your week and not study and get the same grade, right, the overall result, your grade, or in this case GDP, would be the same. However, if we're using that to measure your well-being, obviously if you didn't study at all as compared to studying every single waking hour of the day, you're going to be much better off in the week that you didn't study. Okay? And if it comes down to the final grade, right, or the measure of your output, right, if they're the same and you have no studying as compared to lots of studying, the person who studies less is going to have much more leisure activity and be better off. So we'd say they have a higher standard of living because they're not working every hour studying, or in this case, producing. So the first case that GDP falls short is it doesn't measure the value of leisure. The second way that GDP doesn't measure or capture our standards of living is that there's a lot of things that it produces that may be harmful to us. So if we think of Beijing is a very good example. During the 2008 Olympics, and just recently as last year, Beijing said that their smog levels were very, very high within Beijing, and that it was actually dangerous. So if you look at total, I don't know how they measure it, like parts per million, or however they measure smog activity within Beijing, it's something like 3 times higher than the recommended limit that we would call hazardous. So people living in Beijing have a lower standard of living as compared to other parts of China that have much less smog activity. So if we look at GDP and we have 2 countries, one that pollutes their water, another one that doesn't, but they have the exact same GDP, we would say that the country that has no polluted water is going to be better off as far as their standard of living than the one that has polluted water, even though their GDP activities are going to be the same. So GDP doesn't include, or doesn't adjust so it does not include ills from production, or what we call social ills, or let's see, the negative effects of production. So the negative effects of production. So again, there's a lot of production that may harm the environment or harm us. So one nation has asbestos mining, which kills its people, and another nation produces eco-friendly vehicles that doesn't kill its citizens. But if they have the same GDP, we would say obviously they have different standards of living. One of them, people are dying as a result of that production, other ones are not. But the GDP levels are the same. So GDP doesn't capture that standard of living difference. The third way is it doesn't capture social ills. This could be like crime and so forth. So if we have 2 economies with the same GDP, or you could take, for example, in some parts of St. Louis, you're not going to walk by yourself at night or leave your vehicle parked there. However, in Des Moines, it tends to be relatively safe as compared to those parts of St. Louis. And if St. Louis and Des Moines produce the exact same activity, so the GDP of St. Louis and the GDP of Des Moines were the same, you would say, well, it's safer to live one place, so our standard of living is going to be higher in one place because it has less social ills than the other place. However, GDP doesn't capture those social ills, so it isn't adjusted for crime rates, so forth. It's just measuring production. And then lastly, and I think this one is fundamentally overlooked, is GDP doesn't measure the distribution of income. So it doesn't measure distribution of income. And what we mean by that is only measuring total income. So if we look at the GDP of China and the GDP of Japan, they're roughly the same. Okay? However, it's not measuring the distribution of income. So within China, you have very, very rich people and you have very, very, very poor people. In Japan, you tend to have much less poor people and much less extremely rich people. So overall, the distribution tends to be much more equal in Japan as compared to China, even though their GDPs are the same. Another way to look at it is GDP measures total income. So if we divide by the population, we're looking at GDP per capita. So again, looking at the GDP of China and the GDP of Japan, if we divide those by the population, GDP per capita, or income per person, is much higher in Japan than it is for China. However, that's only measuring average income per person. That's not measuring who has how much or what does that distribution look like. How many poor people, how many rich people, is there a middle class, so forth. And we might think of those as having a strong, healthy middle class leads to a higher standard of living as compared to very, very few rich people and a lot of very, very poor people. So in that case, GDP can't pick up that. It only measures total or average income. It doesn't measure how many rich, how many poor, how many middle class, so forth. So if we look at GDP both as a measure of production and as a measure of standard of living, it fails to capture a few things. First off, it doesn't include household production, and it doesn't include the underground economy. So if we took GDP and could add these things back in, GDP would go up. So we say that GDP is much higher in the US, or production is much higher than GDP is measured in the US, because we would add those things in. Secondly, GDP doesn't adjust for many differences that we would say are important for standards of living, such as the value of our leisure time, negative effects of production, so pollution, chemical spills, explosions, so forth. It doesn't capture social ills such as crime, and it doesn't measure the distribution of income. So when we're looking at GDP data and we take GDP both as a measure of production and as a measure of standard of living, we have to be thinking in the back of our heads, is this the best way to measure what we really want to measure? So if we want to use it to measure crime, for instance, it may not be the best measure to measure crime. All right, and I think that's everything that you need to know for all the shortfalls of GDP.